Hey everyone, it's Dr. Karen, and today I'm going to take a break from our regular content and share an episode from the Authority podcast on the B Podcast Network. Today, I'm pleased to bring you a conversation with Principal Baruti Kafele, author of 7 best-selling books, including the Equity and Social Justice Education 50. This discussion includes topics such as equity versus equality, the strategy versus the goal and why it matters, questions like, does my presence positively alter the trajectory of my students? How do I ensure that no student is invisible in my classroom? How to become credible to your students, and why Kafele wants his readers to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and uncomfortable with being comfortable. This conversation also includes a discussion of the big 3: individuality, identity, and voice, and why these are non-negotiables in every classroom, as well as the leader's role in making equity work resilient. The Authority podcast is another show on the B Podcast Network, and the tagline for the show is interviews with people who know what they're talking about. On The Authority, leadership coach, storytelling strategist, and ed tech advisor Ross Romano interviews leading authors from the education world and beyond to draw out their invaluable insights on leadership, culture building, transformation, and student and educator success. You can join him each week to hear ideas for addressing your current pain points, new perspectives from the authors you admire, and fresh takes from up-and-coming voices. I will share a link in the show notes where you can learn more about the Authority podcast. A little bit more about Baruti Kafele and why I thought this interview would be extremely valuable to you as a listener. He is one of the most sought-after school leadership and classroom equity presenters in America. Principal Kafele has made a huge impact on America's schools, as he has delivered over 2,500 conferences and program keynotes, professional development workshops, parenting seminars, and student assemblies over his 35 years of public speaking. An expert in the area of attitude and transformation, Principal Kafele is the leading authority on providing effective classroom and school leadership strategies toward closing what he coined the attitude gap. He has authored 12 books, including 7 ASCD bestsellers. One thing I wanted to mention before we get going is that this past year, I joined the B Podcast Network for educators and aspiring leaders. This network has a ton of podcasts that are designed to inspire you to level up in your career as an educator, to help you more effectively serve students, and to lead a more fulfilling career. There are a ton of great podcasts on the network covering topics like school leadership, learning and development in the corporate setting, ed tech, entrepreneurship, and a ton of other things that are going to help you think of innovative ways that you can use your skills to serve your clients. To learn more about the B Podcast Network, go to bpodcastnetwork.com.
You're listening to the Authority podcast on the B Podcast Network. Welcome into today's conversation. This is going to be a good one. My guest is Principal Baruti Kafele, author of the Equity and Social Justice Education 50, which is a recent Excellence in Equity Award winner from the American Consortium for Equity and Education. The Equity and Social Justice Education 50, Critical Questions for Improving Opportunities and Outcomes for Black Students, is available from ASCD. Principal Kafele, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's jump right into this part of it. It's the word equity, right? And it's the journey. You write about this in the book of how several years ago was the first time you really started hearing the word used a lot with respect specifically to K-12 education. The concepts around equity have always been around, but the terminology and putting it front and center and saying this is a focal point, it came in. We all sort of rallied around it. It went from an inspiration to, in my observation, over the next handful of years, to almost becoming a cliche in some ways, because every company was throwing it out there and not necessarily thinking, they just knew they had to say it and not necessarily thinking that much about it, to now where we're in an environment where there's certain people who want to treat it as a bad word. And so now it's gone from, we don't hear it that much, to controversial. So I really want to hear from you about your perspective on the term, what equity means in your perspective, and why this is critical that we put this front and center and we don't shy away from it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomenon, this little word called equity. As you said, a few years ago, when it really came on the horizon, where it became a part of the education lexicon, and I would say approximately 2012-ish, 13-ish, 14-ish, here comes this word. And as I listened to it, as I listened to other presenters and began to read what people were saying, then I said, okay, that's what I've been talking about for my entire education life. But now there's a word for it. And so I'm in the right place, in the right space. But then I tend to talk about equity in the context of pre-George Floyd and post-George Floyd. And pre-George Floyd, I think for the most part, folks were all in on this word equity. Because for me, when I think about it, equity is just the latest solution to closing the achievement gap. Whether we're talking about racial, ethnic achievement gap, socioeconomic, language, special needs, whatever it is, it's been a succession of different solutions, different strategies. Here's what we're going to try now. So here's the latest thing. And then equity became that. And so here we are. So then post George Floyd and the politics of America, I don't want to say they shifted, but I want to say that things were uncovered. So now we started to see things, or at least acknowledge things that weren't being acknowledged before as it relates to race. So now with that, simultaneous with that in the education world, this word equity developed a different connotation, and it became the boogeyman, as I say, the four-letter word, the political word, and folks became afraid of it. So it's interesting in terms of the timing of my book, The Equity and Social Justice Education 50, because when it came out, it sold like hotcakes. But as America began to just go through the shift that it went through, starting with the summer of 2020, I noticed a dramatic decrease in sales. So there's a lot of places now that won't touch it, whereas other places will. It just depends on what part of the country we're talking about. But I know I'm kind of giving a very lengthy answer, but let me just say this in terms of what it is. Equity doesn't have a universal definition, right? It's like you think about growth mindset. Anything growth mindset, most of us, if not all of us, would go directly to Carol Dweck's work, Carol Dweck's books, her research. And so therefore we were talking a very universal language as it related to growth mindset. With equity, on the other hand, you got a zillion different people talking about it, and you got another zillion different people writing about it and presenting about it and so forth. But there's not that universal definition to say this is what equity is. So therefore, you got all these interpretations, and quite frankly, some of those interpretations have my head spinning. But there's all these different interpretations of what it is. What I did, I said, let me simplify this. Let me make it as basic, as simple as I possibly can. I said, equity is simply meeting young people, meeting children, or meeting scholars, whatever language the school uses, meeting young people where they are. And then I put these three dots, dot, 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 as they are, period. So eliminating all the verbiage and just meeting young people where they are, as they are. So youngster A comes in here. Youngster B is here. Youngster C is here. Youngster D is here. And the objective of the school, the district, the teacher, is to meet that youngster right there. So whether we're talking academically, socially, emotionally, whatever it is, meet that youngster right there, and let's start to build.
And when there's this debate around, I guess, the validity of an equity focus, a lot of times it's this somewhat semantic, but also this understanding of a debate between equity and equality, right? And so this book is based on these 50 questions for educators to reflect on. And this is the very first one, is about that discussion, equity versus equality. And you write about how equality is the goal, right? Equity is the strategy. And I love the way you write about this because I think it really can, for those who want to really understand and are a little unsure about the difference and why we should be focused on this, I think it puts it into that perspective where in the future, equality was the status quo, then equality would perpetuate the status quo. Equality now would perpetuate this status quo, which is inequity, inequality, right? Could you talk a little more about that distinction that you made, equality as the goal, but not the strategy, and vice versa with respect to equity? Because I do think that for those who have been hearing about this and know those two words, and they're not sure what the difference is, I think that really does help people understand.
Yeah, you're right. And I hear it all the time when I'm on the road speaking to audiences, and they think that there are people in audiences. I don't want to say all, but there are people in audiences that think that these are synonymous words. That it's just a matter of which one you're using, but they're very different. Equity, as you just said, is a strategy, period. It is not an intended outcome. It's a strategy to get to the intended outcome. And we can use equality as that intended outcome just for the sake of discussion here, that I want to pursue equality in terms of outcomes of young people, that we're all achieving at high levels, whatever that means. But toward getting there, I can't use equality as the strategy. So I'll say to an audience, for example, particularly when I'm in a lecture mode or doing a keynote address, that what I'm doing with you all as adult learners in this environment, I guess I can pull it off and give you all the same thing at the same time and hope that you all are hearing me. But in a classroom, I could never do that. Right? There's a time for direct instruction, but at some point, you and I have to transition out of that and start to look at the individuality of each youngster. So now we're talking about equity because you got young people in different spaces. You got young people in different places. You got young people with different experiential backgrounds. So all that has to be considered, different realities, all that has to be considered in the equitable classroom. I've got this youngster or this group of youngsters, this individual youngster, whatever it is, but I've got to be able to create a structure within that classroom that I'm able to meet each of them where they are. So that becomes a strategy to get to that intended outcome of equality, where all youngsters are achieving at high levels, but we had to take different roads to get there.
Right. Yeah. And I think most listeners have probably seen that.
Yeah,
that image of the kids of different heights standing on the boxes to see over the fence. And it demonstrates, okay, if they're all in the same size box, that's equality, and one kid can't see over the fence. But the nature of it is that it's shifting, right? So equity is a strategy to make the shift from inequality toward equality. Same thing would happen. That image might be oversimplified, but if the short kid had a growth spurt, he might trade boxes with the other kid, right? Things are continuously moving, but we're recognizing within education that our job is to move it. One of the things that, right on that point about what our job to move things, one of the things that I love the most about what you write about and talk about in all of your work is the importance of the individual educator, the teacher, the administrator, to see themselves as somebody whose presence is adding value to the student. The question you have in this book is, does my presence positively alter the trajectory of my students? And it's along the lines of, are my students at an advantage because I'm their teacher? Is my school better because I lead it? All of those things that as individual educators, we want to be looking at ourselves and saying, if you replaced me with somebody else, would that be worse? Because what I'm doing here is making a difference. And that's something that I think as well, wherever anybody's coming to this conversation, whatever their prior history or awareness of specific to equity and social justice is, that's an aspiration that educators would like to see themselves in, to say, okay, I am uniquely valuable to my students here. When you position that question in this regard, and particularly talking about positively altering their trajectory, and that's what this is all about, is those trajectories. How do you put that to educators, and what do you want them to really be thinking of within that?
Yeah, you think about young people coming to a school with just very different experiential backgrounds, various different realities, challenges, obstacles, etc. So my question, I would say 100% of the time when a teacher is in front of me, what is it about you? What is it about your practice as a teacher? What is it about your purpose? What is it about your vision that significantly alters the trajectory of children? That is a tough question. Just like, are my students at an advantage because I'm their teacher? Those are the kinds of questions that bring silence to a room. Is my school a better school because I lead it? Nobody wants to talk. There's not abundance of hands going up when I ask that question. Everybody's quiet, and I'm begging for a response. But I understand why the room is silent. They'll tell me privately later, or publicly, they'll tell me why it's quiet, because everybody's processing. Everybody's digging deep, looking at themselves within the context of the question. So I'm saying to the teacher, to go back to the question about altering the trajectory, one has to look at oneself and say, what is it that I do with, as it relates to each individual student? And that word each is key versus the word all, right? What is it that I do as it relates to each of the students that I'm able to make that connection toward helping that youngster to have a willingness, and that's another key word, a willingness to soar. When we talk about the difference between, I talk about closing the attitude gap, and inherent in that definition is the will to achieve, the will to soar. So what is it about me, who I am as teacher in that classroom, that in terms of my practices with that youngster has that willingness to grow, to develop, to evolve? Is there something about me that alters that trajectory? And that's just a question that's got to be asked of that teacher all the time. So then with that, various different indicators that I talk about as it relates to that, whether it be the climate and the culture of the classroom learning environment, whether it be the attitude of me, the teacher, right? Whether it be to what extent equity is a reality in that classroom, right? And we can look at so many other variables in terms of what would contribute to whether or not the trajectory of that child is in fact increasing because I am the teacher in the classroom or the leader in the school.
Right. Yeah. And what I particularly love about it is that it centers the personal nature of the work and the necessity of each individual to connect themselves and their own values, vision, objectives personally into the work in incremental fashion. And all those things you can see from the inside when you're doing the work that people judging from the periphery can't see, can't tell, don't necessarily know what you're doing, and aren't the ones that have to ultimately keep you motivated to keep doing the work. We know about this term that a lot of has to be aware of with respect to their impact on others around like microaggressions. And I don't know what the opposite of that is, but there's these micro moments of positivity, of positive trajectory, where you start to alter things in the right direction when you're doing the right things consistently. And depending on where you are, where you're starting from, where your students are, where you're taking them, it may not always look like big success, or you know that you're not at your end goal. You could be doing, for example, a really excellent job transforming the culture within the front office of the Knicks, but they're still the Knicks. So from the outside, it might still look like that team's a mess, but you're doing a great job. And that relates to, this is a personal reflective work. And one of the things you wrote about in this story, and I think is part of, you've been writing books now for a decade, and after having been obviously a school leader for a long time. I've been writing
books since 1990.
Well, even more then, but writing books and as school leader and thinking about, but there's clear that there's consistency across your work, but also an evolution within that. And there's things that you had a different perspective on once you were more advanced in your career as administrator, once you went into consulting, once you became an author, that you thought about things that you knew then that you wish you had known earlier. One of them was about sharing your personal story with respect to equity and how it would have made an effect on your students. And can you talk about that a little bit, that feeling of it's regret? Now you have opportunities to obviously share that even more widely, but to say, okay, why do you think you didn't realize then that it would have been valuable? What was it about the culture of schools, maybe, and your experience as a student and then becoming an educator that didn't make it seem like the natural thing to do to share about your own life, which was really relevant to your students' lives?
Yeah, I think it was more so just my warped thinking that I had to uphold this image that I had created and that students had come to embrace of who I was as principal. When I say created, because who I am, I make this distinction between Baruti Kafele and Principal Kafele. They're in the same body, but they're two very different entities. Principal Kafele is when I'm working. It's not an act. It's just that I'm in a different state of mind. When I'm in that Principal Kafele mode, I speak so much better when I'm, just as an example, when I'm Principal Kafele versus when I'm in Baruti Kafele mode, when I'm very relaxed, not really conscious of how my words are being expressed. But when I'm Principal Kafele, then I sound very articulate and intelligent and all that kind of stuff. This thing as a principal, that's what I would morph into as I woke up in the morning. The drive, I was there. So that's who they saw. And I said, I don't know that I want them to see before that or after work what I morph back into, because then they may use that as an excuse. When we talk about me having graduated from high school in 5 years, having attended 4 different schools because mom is shifting me about trying to find the right fit so that her son could become something, right? And I'm like, is that what I want to put out there? And then they say, you just like us. And now in hindsight, long hindsight, it's like I should have, because they know now, because so many of them know me also through social media. So I've been very public with that. They can listen to videos and hear that. And it's like the connection is there. Those that reach out and want to have any kind of dialogue about it. So in hindsight, if I had it to do all over, and trust me when I tell you, I contemplate going back to the ranks of the principalship every day. So if I ever did, which I have no idea, but if I ever did, then I would lead that way. Let the youngsters know who I was before I became Principal Kafele, because I think it matters in terms of knowing the whole me.
Right. Yeah, it occurred to me that I wonder how much that concept relates to one of the questions you pose in the book, one of the important points about how do I ensure that no student is invisible in my classroom, and seeing students for who they are and making them know that you want to see who they are. Because I think a lot of times when we feel invisible, we feel that people don't want to see us, so we're motivated to stay invisible because we think, oh, if I get their attention, it's going to be negative attention. If I'm the backup singer and I all of a sudden come out to the front of the stage and start doing a solo, everybody's thinking, I'm here to see the other people. Like, this is not, and there's a lot of situations where people feel like that in life. Right? Now you're meant to be over there in the background, or you're meant to blend in, or as anybody, but in this case, as an educator, you're all students and you're not necessarily individuals, or there's one way I want to do that. And I can see how for a student sets in to say, look, I'm doing okay here. I'm just going to go along to get along. Nobody's really paying that much attention to me, but that's fine because at least I'm not getting in trouble or a negative attention. And then how that moves into adulthood, and it's relating back to those students and thinking about, okay, yeah, like, do they want to see me? If they see me for who I am, how can they use that against me versus can they use it for them? I think it's all related, and it's how our educators and students relate to one another and understand that our identities and our personalities and our uniqueness is what makes us be able to have relationships.
One of the things I say, a lot of teachers will say to me, they'll say, share my story, but the students don't seem to care or connect with it. I hear that all the time. And I particularly hear it when we're talking about two different racial groups. So white teacher, black student, for example. But I've also heard it when it's black teacher, black student, when it's a black teacher that's struggling. And here's the thing that I say to them all the time. I say, your story really can't be told until you've earned the right to tell it. If they don't care about you, what you've presented thus far, then they may not really care about your story, about your journey to get to where you are. But if you've earned some credibility with them, if you've been able to forge some type of bond, some type of trust between them and you, now your story will matter because you matter. I talk a lot about standing outside, shaking hands with youngsters before they enter the building as a principal. I'm an advocate of principals doing the same. And I say to them, I say that handshake followed by my message in the morning, my morning message, they matter only if I matter. If I don't matter, then that handshake means nothing. That morning message means nothing. But if I've earned the right to shake their hand, earned the right to deliver a message in the morning, to the extent that we look forward to seeing our principal, we look forward to hearing from our principal, now my story has relevance. So I say to folks all the time, make sure that you're not just jumping in there and now let me tell my story, because they may be able to identify with it. They don't know you yet, and they may not even like you. So first start there with just trying to forge that bond, and then you could work your way to the story. Interestingly, with assemblies, I guess I was a different guy, because assemblies, I always told my story, but I didn't start with it. I started with just a message. So as I feel I'm connecting with these students that I don't know, just some gymnasium or auditorium, but I'm giving them this message to get them thinking about how they can get from point A to B. Then when I feel like, okay, we're bonding, then I hit them, bam. But let me tell you about my background. Let me tell you about where I was compared to where I am now. So now it's wow, because in their mind, I'm somebody now. They know about the books and all the other things that come along with that. And it's like, oh, you came from where many of us are. And now look at you now. But had I started I went to high school for 5 years. I had a 1.5 GPA. Like, and we in the same bag as you. So it doesn't.
Why they hire this guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that, and the way that, because you also share about the importance of making sure you're seen as credible to your students. And one of the words that comes to mind for me is patience, right? Patience is a necessity to earn credibility in anything. It's interpersonal credibility. You need to be patient to take the time to show you that I care about you, that I am here for you, and so on and so forth. And the same is credibility